Robbie Damlin lost her son. Shireen, her brother and grandmother. Ali sacrificed his brother. Marvat lost her grandfather. Dori lost his brother. And Ronnie, 2 sons. In 1948, the State of Israel was declared in what was formerly Palestinian territory. Israel was to be a homeland for Jewish people from around the world. The state would also be a home to thousands of European Jews who were displaced by the Holocaust. One of the first acts of the new state was to establish its borders and to protect its citizens. Almost 1 million Palestinians fled to live in refugee camps in the West Bank, Gaza, and neighboring countries. Palestinians describe this as the Nakba, or Great Catastrophe. Since the Nakba, Israel and its Palestinian neighbors, now confined to the West Bank and Gaza, have been living in a perpetual state of war with each other. The Palestinians want their land back, and Israel wants to protect its state and citizens at all cost. Both sides have paid a heavy price for the conflict, often in blood.
The Palestinians and the Israelis made these wonderful candles. So we had
My name is Robbie Damlin, and I came to live in Israel in 1967. Actually, I came here to save the country in the Six-Day War.
Robbie immigrated to Israel from South Africa 40 years ago. In her time in Israel, she's seen conflict and lived through tragedy. Robbie is a grandmother now. After some very difficult times between her and her son Iran, they are now good friends. Israel is still in conflict with its neighbors. It is a conflict that has asked of Robbie the ultimate sacrifice. It has also taken her life on a path she never expected.
אני בסדר גמור. מה העניינים? מה לעשות? היא שולחת אותי, ואני משארת, ואני הולך לטלפון. מה נשמע? אמא? כמה?
תשים את זה שם. Hello, darling.
When I came here, there was this extreme euphoria of the Six-Day War. I mean, Israelis, not like 3 weeks before the war, had thought that that was the end of Israel. And, you know, they were surrounded by such a huge amount of enemies, you know, with huge armies and the threatening of Nasser, that I think they couldn't actually believe what happened in the Six-Day War. And that it happened so quickly and that, you know, relatively speaking, without any damage. And this euphoria created this madness for building and for putting down a stake. And of course, today, when you look at all the results of all this madness are the settlements. And what a wrong decision that was, and how much more valuable it could have been if we had made peace then, or how many more lives would have been saved.
The conflict also took a personal toll on Robbie's life.
I got married, I think it was about 6 years after I came to Israel. And then I had 2 children, one after the other. I was married for 11 years. The last place we lived was on a moshav. And it didn't work out, and I got divorced. And then from then on, David and Iran and I were like this kind of triangle that lived together.
When my parents divorced, when I was about 10, we all moved to a very small apartment in Tel Aviv, and then we had to share everything, you know, clothes, and it was a very tough period over there. And yeah, we grew up together very, very close.
And it was a very liberal kind of a background, because I wasn't your conventional mother, you know, and I wanted my children to take responsibility for their lives and to be able to have dignity and to give dignity to people around them.
The days of joy were short-lived. In 1973, Israel was at war with its neighbors once again.
The situation was really very weird in 73. You know, there were the blackouts at night, and suddenly I started knitting balaclavas for the soldiers. I can't knit. I mean, it's pathetic. Any poor soldier that got my hats must have killed himself laughing. But there was very little that you could do except be there and look after your children and go to the shelter if needed. But there was, I think, for the first, again, a sense of fear, you know, that something, the outcome of the war was not sure, especially in the first days.
Robbie realized that she and her family could not be spared the horrors of war forever. Soon her own sons would have to take up their duty as soldiers and protectors of the State of Israel. Israelis have to do 3 years of national service, and they normally do it after finishing high school.
You know, there's a sense of being invincible also that I keep saying. It's like young soldiers. Why, the people who go to the army, why do they always call up very young men of 18? Because when you're 28 and 30, you're much wiser and you know that it's possible that you won't come back. But when you're 18, you think you're invincible. Sometimes I think if the generals had to actually go to war themselves, I think we'd have a lot less war. Sometimes I feel so guilty. No, why didn't I recognize the dangers for my own children? And I really believed when they were little that by the time they were 18 there would be peace. And I remember going to say goodbye to Iran when he got called up. And this terrible fear that started, you know, that just went on because Iran was in the army, and the difference in age between Iran and David was a year and a month. And I remember standing there at the place where they were inducted into the army and saying goodbye to Iran and seeing him get on the bus and not believing that he actually, you know, would be carrying a gun. This lovely kid, you know, who grew up in such a liberal-minded house, who was taught to be tolerant and not have any racial prejudices or religious prejudices. You can't believe that something will happen to your child, and your child also doesn't believe that something would happen to them.
Although Robbie had a very good relationship with both her sons, David was always the one she had most in common with. They were kindred spirits and shared a love for the arts. David also devoted his life to the peace process, a cause he shared with his mother. After his initial 3 years of military service, David studied to get his master's in the philosophy of teaching. But it was not the end of his military service. He still had to complete his reserve duties, normally a month a year. That often means doing duty in the occupied Palestinian territories of the West Bank and Gaza. And with this, David had a serious issue.
He belonged to Peace Now, and it was a big conflict for him. And he said to me, look, I don't know what to do. Because if I don't go, what will happen to the students that I'm teaching who are going to be inducted into the army? What kind of an example is that? And if I don't go, what will happen to my soldiers? Because he was the officer. And if I do go, then I will treat people with respect, and so will all my soldiers. And that's what I keep telling people all over the world who look at things just with black and white, you know, that there's so much gray in the middle, and that people have this tremendous conflict here about what to do. You know, what's the right thing to do? You were brought up all your life knowing that you had to serve in the military.
David decided to report for duty and was sent with his platoon to the Valley of the Thieves checkpoint inside the West Bank. Their duty was to stop and check all Palestinian cars and pedestrians and to make sure they carried the right papers. This checkpoint has been in existence since the British occupation of the area after the First World War, and it served no purpose other than controlling traffic between the two Palestinian villages. But on March the 3rd, 2002, it would serve another purpose. The hills and thick bush surrounding the checkpoint gave excellent cover to a Palestinian sniper. He used this cover to get close to his target. He took careful aim, and in the first light of day, killed 10 people. David was one of them.